I actually want to return to the point about executioners and about violence and like those aspects. So I'm not sure like if it's even appropriate to ask Ukrainians this question, because I get asked that a lot and it's quite annoying, but I'd like to hear your opinion about that. So what Russia is doing in Ukraine is basically the act of genocide. So trying to erase the culture, trying to erase people based on their national identity. And a lot of people now are asking about reconciliation, about, okay, so if the war ends, how do we live together in a world where the executioner, the one who commits this genocide, is actually next to us? So, and then it also opens the door for the question of should we include Russians or liberal Russians or Russians of any sort in any discussions on whatsoever, on any topic. So what is your take on that? Should we, how can we actually approach this question? And returning to my question about connections and analogies, would it even be appropriate to talk about, because this is also coming up quite often, about Germany after World War II and how everybody like became friends and now it's like a progressive country and so on and so on. So is it appropriate to talk about this? Is it the time to talk about this? And what is your take in general on this question?
So I think that the problem of Russia is that it does not have an alternative vision of its own polity, like what Russia really means. And do they have the historical roots to rethink what Russia is? They do. But these historical roots are very, very deep. And I mean primarily these republics of Novgorod and Pskov, but they were exterminated very long time ago. Since then, there was no ideology, there was no intellectual movement that would conceptualize Russia in a different non-imperial terms. That's the difference with Germany, for example. In Germany, you have Enlightenment. In Germany, you have Immanuel Kant. In Germany, you have lots of people who would say that, no, the key task of the state is not the hierarchy and domination. The key task of the state is I don't know, the well-being of individuals or whatever else. The same we can say about France, of course, about Britain, about Poland, about Italy, about many, many other countries. So there is this gap in the Russian intellectual tradition, political tradition. The problem is that they even did not use the opportunity to kind of develop their liberalism after the Bolshevik coup d'etat. Because what happened with these key intellectuals of Russia, which were put onto the ship, the so-called philosopher's ship in 1922, if I'm not mistaken, and just deported. People like Berdyaev and others. What they must have been doing, they should have been saying, okay, the whole history of this Russian imperialism is a mistake. We are now having this Bolshevism as a kind of a repetition of this mistake in different terms, not only mistake, but a crime. And we should now think in terms of individual rights, freedoms, liberal values, etc. They failed to do that. The only emigre from the Russian Empire who was doing that was Isaiah Berlin. And Isaiah Berlin, you say? How you say it? Isaiah Berlin. And not people like Berdyaev or Struve or else. Instead, all these people were developing the ideas of Russian idea, the book by Berdyaev, Ruskaya Idea, or something like that. So they replaced the idea of Marxism. They were all Marxists, by the way. They replaced the idea of Marxism, like the big proletariat, blah, 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 with this idea of Russian idea, the idea of Russian state. And this is kind of set of ideas is now used by Putin. Ivan Ilyin, who is very known by Putin, admires him, also comes from this generation. So I do think that, and I do think that I'm always saying with this to our Western partners who are kind of trying to help the Russian liberals, the Russian immigration, etc. And I understand them. They have empathy, and they think that helping Ukrainians, helping Belarusians emigrate, helping Russians emigrate is the same story. For Ukrainians, of course, it's not the same story. And the same that Belarus and Russia is also not the same story. But what I'm saying to them is, look, it's not about bad Putin and good Russian society. It's not about, there is a problem of tyranny of one person and oligarchy, and when you remove it, everything will be fine. It's a problem, much a deeper problem of the history and tradition of the Russian vision of the world and the Russian vision of politics. And why you need to understand that? Because basically you should be preparing that Russia is attacking Europe. And especially now when Trump is attacking Europe. And I'm really thinking that Europe will be increasingly a kind of a bigger Ukraine in a position that Ukraine already went through. And of course, there is no understanding in Europe about that in most countries. But even if you just set emotions aside and you understand like what is going on, Europe is militarily absolutely unprepared. If Russia says, okay, if Russia wins in Ukraine, of course we are sure that it will not win in Ukraine. But that's another story. And answering your question, how we think about reconciliation, there will be no reconciliation. Ukrainians will be taken as slaves to the Russian army, and then this big army will go to Poland and Baltic states and Romania and Bulgaria and etc. That's something that happened a long time ago, and that is repeating. But there can be another scenario when Russia says, okay, but NATO is inexistent. America will not protect Europe. We are struck in Ukraine. Why don't we hit the Baltic states? Why don't we hit Finland? They are much lesser prepared. They have much weaker army for the moment. They can do that. And unfortunately, there is a very little number of people in Western Europe who are talking about this.
I think that idea of never again versus yes, we can is not particularly understood well enough. This is, again, maybe a pointless thought.
It's not yes, we can. It's we can repeat.
Можно повторить.
That's different.
Yes, exactly, yeah. This may seem a sort of pointless thought experiment, but it struck me that if we had the media environment of the 1970s and 80s, when I started watching the news, and I remember the coverage of Yugoslavia and the outrage and almost the unanimity of views that we had to go and do something to prevent genocide, despite the fact that these are people who have very little at that point that we knew about. If we had that media environment, pre-social media environment, it seems to me that there'd be a very different Western response to the war in Ukraine. But we inhabit a social media digital landscape of fragmented realities, which become highly partisan and which certain actors can manipulate to their advantage. Do you think that's a useful way of thinking? And how do we communicate the Ukrainian reality in this fragmented, fractured and divided informational ecosystem?
Well, I think the very important question is on the receiver side, and how our audience is thinking. And I think we really need to be very frank with the audience and say, look, ask yourself whom you really trust and why you trust. So I think this is a question that, for example, I'm teaching my students and always, where does this piece of information come from? What is the genesis of this? Like, it's like thinking about the hygiene of products that you're consuming. So why I appreciate, Jonathan, that you are here, because I do think that in our virtual world, presence is one of the key virtues. So therefore, people need to understand that. Therefore, for example, if people ask me about the Palestine, about Gaza, I refrain from answering this question. I have my own set of opinions, but I do think that I'm not authorized to answer this question because I have never been there. And I've never been there. I haven't talked to these people. I can have my opinions, but I do think that my opinions will not have authority and should not have authority. But we have all this discourse about Ukraine, coming from people that have never been to Ukraine, that have come here for 2 days, that nobody knows somebody from Ukraine, and basically who are talking out of their ignorance. And therefore, I do think that this conversation with the audience is like, why you think that what Tucker Carlson is saying about Ukraine, why you think it is true, why you think it has any value of thinking about, because if you are not present, then it's obvious that you will do a lot of mistakes. And the same about us. I mean, there are so many people who have some judgments about some regions of Ukraine without really capacity to go there and to be there. So presence is very important virtue, and I think this is when we're talking about Ukraine, I think the key check about trust, the trust check should be about the presence. I mean, how long have you been here? How long have you been with Ukrainian soldiers if you have judgments about what is happening on the front line? Have you visited the front line? Have you understand what a landscape the Ukrainian front line is, etc., etc.?
But is presence enough? Because we also, something we discuss quite a lot is this notion of epistemic injustice, meaning that even if people come to Ukraine, even if people talk to Ukrainians, there's always this thing that, oh, you're not authorized to talk on behalf of yourself because you're prejudiced, non-objective and stuff. So while it's been 3 years into the full-scale war, journalists who come to Ukraine, their texts are still edited by the editors who are sitting somewhere. So is presence enough, or are there other factors that contribute to this notion of trust and to the quality of information we get out of local contexts?
Look, it's a long process. You cannot have it once. I understand that, for example, since the start of the full-scale invasion, I've been to Kharkiv 20 times. And still I'm very, very reluctant to judge about Kharkiv, because there are people living in Kharkiv. Ask them, and I can give you contacts. I can just express some words of admiration, but always find the person who is the closest to the events, who is closest to the senses. And I think we need to be careful about this, because even people who are coming to Ukraine, sometimes you feel, sometimes you understand that, well, still you talk to them so many hours, but still there are some gaps that they're saying, okay, but something that shocks you. But we Ukrainians should also be very demanding about ourselves. Sometimes I have the impression that the only thing we can talk about is Ukraine and our experience. I do think that we need to, to go and to make these bridges and to understand that other experience is also worth listening to. So therefore, for example, we at Ukraine World, we are trying to make Ukraine understood in the world, but also make the world understood in Ukraine. And this is also, we need to start thinking in a non-provincial way, in a much global way.